Okay. Adiós, Presidenta. ¿Podemos ir a ver sentados? Can we speak from whatever you want?
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the Embassy of Argentina, and welcome to the presentation of this book, Argentina's 2001 Default, Myths and Realities, a book co-sponsored by Jubilee USA Network. Well, this hall seems to be full already. Let me remind you that we have monitors in the foyer to this hall and in the Ambassador's Hall. So those of you standing maybe will be able to find a sitting place over there. This evening we are going to have 4 speakers. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to each of them. Then we'll have some time for question and answers. And as a closing, we'll invite you to a reception with Argentine wines. Again, in the foyer to this floor and in the Ambassador's Hall. So, our first speaker this evening is the Ambassador of the Argentine Republic to the United States of America, Jorge Argüello. He's been for many years a legislator or a representative in Argentina. And before this position, he's been ambassador of Argentina to the United Nations for more than 4 years during Argentina's presidency of the G27. So, Ambassador Argüello, the floor is yours.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the Embassy of the Argentine Republic to the United States. Argentina's 2001 Myth and Default and Realities represents an unprecedented effort from the Embassy of the Argentine Republic to Washington, aimed at elucidating many of the misconceptions and inaccurate ideas promoted by vested interests and simply misinformed stakeholders about the current status of the Argentine debt. Argentina's default was an unavoidable part of our 2001 economic collapse. As many of you know, in the middle of its worst socio-economic crisis and recession since the 1930s, Argentina was forced to default on its sovereignty debt, the largest in history, as a result of 1, a fiscally unfeasible fixed exchange rate regime established during the 1990s, a series of external shocks, and the questionable lending policies inspired by the International Monetary Fund. In those days, our GDP declined by more than 20%. Unemployment skyrocketed to 25%. Poverty soared to 50%. Banks failed and depositors lost their savings. However, despite the delicate social, economic, and political unrest, Argentina never repudiated its debt. This book focuses on the restructuring of the sovereign debt and the socio-economic recovery of Argentina. Argentina has come a long way in an impressive process of economic recovery with broad social inclusion, despite the magnitude and the complexity of its debt and the complete lack of financial support from the international community. As part of this recovery, we have settled 92% of our defaulted debt and are fully committed to finding a comprehensive solution where all parties still involved are treated equally fair and that no one is paid more expeditiously or in better terms than the vast majority of Argentinians who suffered the burden imposed by the 2001 crisis. At the same time, Argentina abided by its international obligations and has cooperated with the U.S. judiciary, abided by its international obligations, particularly in the context of both the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, the ICSID, and the IMF, and has cooperated with the U.S. judiciary with regard to those cases brought against Argentina by the so-called vulture funds. The vulture funds, who bought distressed debt for mere pennies and then refused to participate in the two swaps, 2005 and 2010, hoping to sue Argentina for the face value of their bonds plus interest. Argentina put its debt on a sustainable path as a result of the unorthodox policies implemented during the government of President Nestor Kirchner and continued by the government of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, whose macroeconomic framework allows me to say today that after tough decisions and great sacrifices, Argentina has ceased to be part of the problem to become part of the solution. After tough decisions and great sacrifices, Argentina has ceased to be part of the problem and become part of the solution. In fact, during the current global financial crisis, Argentina's experience may offer some valuable lessons. For instance, abusive demands of financial markets are incompatible with economic growth. Economic growth is a key determinant of debt repayment capacity, since not only will fiscal austerity worsen crisis. Also, we have shown that an equitable distribution of losses between creditors and debtors and pro-growth policies is the right answer, and renewed international cooperation is required to regulate sovereign debt restructuring and capital flight. Argentina's 2001 default, myth and realities provides our version of the history of the crisis and describes the efforts made by Argentina during the last decade by providing a response to the questions most frequently raised about this issue in a consistent, brief, and systematic manner. The book analyzes the history of Argentina default, the efforts made by the Argentine government to normalize its debt obligations, a comparison between the debt restructuring process in Argentina and in Greece, the repercussions of Argentina's debt situation in the United States, the proceedings before the ICSID, and the recognition of our success in the United States. Last but not least, I would like to sincerely thank our panelists, Argentine Minister of Economy and Finances, and today's keynote speaker, Dr. Hernán Lorenzino. Muchas gracias. Mr. Eric Lecomte, who is the Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network, the event's co-sponsor. Muchas gracias. And Mark Weisbrot, co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Thank you, Mark. I hope the collective effort made by the team of the Embassy of the Argentine Republic to the United States serves to shed a light on the plight experienced by Argentina at the beginning of the 21st century and help better understand that there is not a universal remedy when dealing with crisis. Argentina's 2001 default, myth and realities, shows that it is really possible to challenge the established order, often the true responsible for economic collapses, and to find solutions that benefit our nations and not financial speculators. We have long owed this to the United States public and no less to the Argentine people, who bore painful sacrifices during the last decade. We fervently wish that the target we follow with this book will be accomplished. Thank you very much for your presence.
Okay, our next speaker this evening is Mr. Eric Lecomte. Eric Lecomte is the Executive Director of Jubilee USA Network and represents a civil society coalition of 75 US member organizations, 200 faith communities, and 50 Jubilee global partners. Jubilee USA Network has won critical global financial reforms and more than $100 billion in debt relief for the world's poorest countries, so the money could be reinvested in social infrastructure. Eric leads a network that includes relief, environmental, human rights, and religious organizations, and he currently focuses on development in relationship to the international debt crisis. He serves on expert working groups to the United Nations Committee on Trade and Development and to the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights. Eric has 15 years of experience working with faith-based organizations to impact global policy on poverty, conflict, and human rights. Eric is a graduate of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, where he received degrees in peace studies and sociology. He was named the Pax Christi Ambassador, and he is the former National Council Chair of Pax Christi USA. Eric, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and a special thanks to all the other panelists, in particular the Embassy for hosting us tonight, as well as Minister Lorenzino for being here with us. So essentially tonight, as we've gathered to reflect on the new publication, the new book, looking at the reality of how Argentina was able to deal with its financial crisis in 2001. As your first speaker tonight, what I'd like to do is take some of the messages that are in this book and extrapolate them further in terms of what they mean globally. So beyond just looking at Argentina, and then I know that when Mark and the minister follow me, they'll go into more specifically some of the history and the particular pieces around Argentina. But, there's no doubt at this point Argentina, as being a country that went through a dramatic financial crisis and dealt with it in very specific ways, I think has lessons that are very applicable right now to look at globally. As was mentioned, Jubilee USA works specifically on sovereign debt issues. And with our global partners at the Center for at CEPR, and also with our member coalition, we have won, as was mentioned, over $100 billion in debt relief. And so we look at some of the lessons from Argentina and see how they can be viewed more globally. One of the things that Jubilee USA Network engages in is also a lens of how these particular policies impact the most vulnerable and the poorest people in our world. And although Argentina, I think, is a great example of how these policies can be dealt with, and we strongly support Argentina, I think we also need to acknowledge that these policies on a global perspective are policies that keep poor people poor. The reality, I think, right now when we're looking at the conversation is that, this is a conversation that's also about how is growth stimulated in a country during a financial crisis. And that's the exact same conversation that's taking place in U.S. Congress right now, where there are those, admittedly not enough, that are calling for a stimulation of the economy, and there are those that are calling for more austerity. And in regards to issues like vulture funds, which the ambassador mentioned, responsible lending and borrowing, and looking at how do we really get ourselves in a position where we can resolve debts, Argentina is squarely placed within this current conversation. The comments that I'll make around those three areas are also ones that I think issues that as much as possible, I also hope to lift up the U.S. perspective on these particular issues as well. The first issue, which, when you look at the book that I want to lift up that the book comments on, is specifically looking at the issue of vulture funds, which the ambassador defined. Again, essentially what vulture funds are. So vulture funds are when a creditor will buy up for pennies on the dollar existing debt on the secondary market. So in other words, country X has a loan from a corporation for anything from a dam project to building infrastructure. For various reasons, that country may have slid into a financial crisis, as we saw with Argentina. And when that happens, loans, or rather I should say hedge funds, funds known as vulture funds, come in on the secondary market and they buy these loans up for pennies on the dollar in hopes of settling for a strong profit. It's a growing problem, and specifically, Argentina, as the ambassador has mentioned, has continued to deal with several vulture funds. In terms of these particular vulture funds, and I think what they mean right now, not only for Argentina, but countries worldwide, when we're looking at the whole question of vulture funds, the place where I think the conversation is actually most relevant to us right now is in the state of New York. Many of these loans, which are bought up from the secondary market, the initial contracts, if these loans were to be arbitrated, are in places like New York City and London. This is the jurisdiction. And so laws that are passed which support and promote vulture funds in these jurisdictions will take these loans once they've bought them from the secondary market and be able to force judgment in these jurisdictions. It's something at Jubilee USA that we've had to learn a lot about very quickly because I think some of the most problematic laws that promote and protect vulture funds in U.S. state law have actually just been being pushed over the last few weeks. So at Jubilee USA, we felt it incumbent upon ourselves to mobilize our 4,000 members in New York State and essentially demand the legislatures, the Senate and the Assembly, kill these pieces of legislation. And there's no doubt that our voice is having a dramatic impact. In terms of vulture funds, what's interesting is before we got our voice into this brawl in New York State, two other groups had already had their voices to some extent registered, but I wouldn't say have been strong in their registry. But one of those groups is actually other investment firms in New York. So legitimate investment firms that are investing in projects around the world. Who see that if these vulture funds are able to pass this kind of legislation, it's going to make governments as well as investors around the world much less likely to have contracts arbitrated in New York or in London, which means huge loss of profits for what could be considered essentially legitimate investment ventures. Another area to look at is actually U.S. corporations. Because vulture funds, again, come in on the secondary market, when they're forcing a resolution, often a country has to provide all funds it has, even funds that it may have sectioned off to a U.S. corporation for payment of a project. But once that money is located by the vulture fund, they can actually seek within the country's distress access to that specific fund so that these corporations will have their payments essentially garnished. And a group that at Jubilee I would say we're a little bit more closely aligned with that has also called in great concern with this particular legislation is the New York State Bars Association, who has said that these two pieces of legislation which are being promoted by vulture funds right now actually serve no actual public purpose. The laws, one of them is designed to be able to litigate a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Zambia essentially into submission. So, for us, it's really important that we see that as the debt crisis has migrated from the global south to the global north, how it has spread, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that this particular legislation, which is being pushed in New York, will have very powerful impacts on Zambia, on the Ivory Coast, on Paraguay, and on Ecuador. Not to mention, these same vulture funds that are promoting the legislation currently in New York are actually the ones that are involved in buying up debt on the secondary market across Southern Europe right now. And as we come out of the reflections of the Euro crisis, I think what's very clear to assume is that these pieces of legislation will further empower these same vulture funds to do this kind of behavior. The last comment that I want to mention about vulture funds before moving on to my other 2 points specifically is to speak, upon how we see our context. Again, we're very lucky at Jubilee USA to have a very broad coalition, but one of the groupings that we represent are most of the Big Ten churches, religious communities in the United States. We also represent very strong Jewish policy organizations, as well, as represent and work closely with the American Jewish World Service. And coming from that perspective, to speak very plainly about vulture funds, you're not going to find a rabbi, a pastor, or an imam that's out there that's going to tell you it's okay to make money off the backs of the poor. And that's what we're talking about. What vulture funds are very simply is trying to make money off the backs of the poor, especially when we look at these cases of Zambia, Ivory Coast, Paraguay, and Ecuador. I think ultimately, this transitions to the second point, which, I think is important to pull up from a much broader context, the pieces of this report. And that's, specifically looking at, in light of lessons from the 2001 default, what's now being promoted, I think, as responsible lending and borrowing. So essentially, none of this is rocket science. All this is responsible lending and borrowing is saying that lenders and borrowers should know what they are getting into, and it should just be completely above board. Now, it sounds, a little bit silly to speak about something so plainly, but it really is that plain. Recently at Jubilee USA in March, we released our new report on responsible lending and borrowing. And there are some, key principles from responsible lending and borrowing that our report puts out there. And I think just to mention a few of them, and I think, again, these things are actually things, many of which are extrapolated from how Argentina moved through its particular debt crisis. But there are 11 points in all. I'm not going to bore you with all of them. You can go online and be bored as you read them. But just to give you a snapshot about some of the most important pieces is that before a lender lends to a country, a lender should know that the country or borrower can pay back the money. So again, not rocket science, but many of these principles are actually missing from the international financial architecture. There should be, a full sense of what the debt of a low-income country is, and for that matter, any country now, as we've seen this debt crisis spread to the north, in terms of what their entire portfolio is of debt. No harmful conditions should be attached to loans. That the regulation of vulture funds, the secondary sale of loans in the market should just be made illegal. That there needs to be a recognition that there are profound financial crises that take place, which we're all aware of and have all taken place, and there needs to be opportunities to see how a financial crisis impacts a particular lending and borrowing arrangement. At the end of the day, that there are certain standards in terms of human rights, in terms of environmental law, and in terms of the business community that should be taken into effect and looked at broadly around lending and borrowing. So these particular pieces are very important. And, you know, as an expert at Jubilee, we've worked with the government of Argentina around actually producing principles of responsible lending and borrowing. And we're happy to say some very strong principles came out of a process that we were involved in with the UN Commission on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. And now these principles have been supported by the government of Argentina, and these same principles the U.S. government is supporting as voluntary principles. And so I think this is really key to understand as we're looking at these issues, because these essentially principles of responsible lending and borrowing not only are good for poor people, but they're good for all of us. And the final piece I think that I'd just like to speak a little bit about that comes out of this experience, it's alluded to in terms of some of the lessons which are built up from this book, is one of these very principles. Now, this particular principle doesn't exist in the UN Committee on Trade and Development Principles on Responsible Lending and Borrowing, but it is one that generally we think is very important and that we've pulled out to look at, and that's the support for a independent resolution debt workout process. So in other words, when any country has a particular debt, that these debts are able to be worked out according to certain principles, to certain processes. And that is that there is some resolution process in looking at debt that takes into account, number one, impartiality in decision-making, rather than right now where the lender alone or the creditor alone is making decisions. Once a case is filed, that there is an automatic stay on loan enforcement. Third, that there's an impartial assessment of the validity of individual claims as well as the legitimacy of loans. And finally, that there is a neutral process for working the debt out. And these principles essentially reflect the leading principles of corporate and individual insolvency laws in almost every nation around the globe. Yet this current process is actually missing from the international financial architecture. And so recently, the minister hosted my counterpart from Jubilee, Germany, Jürgen Kaiser, as well as Joe Stiglitz in Argentina, for a conversation on this particular process. And I think right now, as we've seen this debt crisis spread from the south to the north, we see new opportunities to build broad support on creating a process that can work us out of debts. So, you know, in closing, I think, you know, from the perspective of Jubilee USA, it's critical for all of us, for governments in the South, governments in the North, to be dealing with these particular issues. And we've been very pleased nationally with legislation that we've previously introduced on vulture funds, as well as our own Jubilee Act looking at responsible lending and borrowing, that these particular pieces of legislation have had the lead introducers of Congresswoman Waters, Chairman Spencer Backus of Financial Services, Judy Biggert from Illinois, as well as Congressman Barney Frank. And I think what that says about a lot of this work is that, you know, a lot of these initiatives are being introduced jointly together by Republicans and Democrats because they agree that a financial system which is allowed to be reckless, which is allowed to be uncurbed, is not only dangerous for the global South, but it's dangerous for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Mark Weisbrot. Mark Weisbrot is a co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research here in Washington, D.C. He has written numerous research papers on economic policy, especially on Latin America, and international economic policy, including on the economic development of Argentina during the last 12 years, and is a widely cited expert on the region. He is also co-author with Dean Baker of Social Security, The Phony Crisis. Mark writes a weekly column for The Guardian Unlimited in the UK, and a regular column on economic and policy issues that is distributed to over 550 newspapers by McClatchy Tribune Information Services. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and almost every major US newspaper, as well as in Brazil's largest newspaper, A Folha de São Paulo. He appears regularly on national and local television and radio programs. He is also president of Just Foreign Policy. Mark received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. Mark, the floor is yours.
So thanks to everybody for this and for coming to this. It's not usual, not always that you get a packed audience for a subject like any country's economy, even this one. And I want to thank the Minister and the Ambassador and Eric for his presentation and his great work and the work of Jubilee. And I want to start with, and by the way, if you're interested in the numbers, I didn't bring any PowerPoint today, but you can find all of it on our website at cepr.net, in our papers and various PowerPoint presentations. So I want to start with just the overall success of the Argentine economy, because it's not well known in the United States. In fact, Paul Krugman pointed this out in his blog not that long ago, and he took a slap at the media in the United States and the international media. He said, this really doesn't say much. The fact that nobody knows how successful the Argentine economy has been, it really doesn't say a lot. It doesn't say much for the state of economic reporting. And I would have to second that. Because, the economy has grown in the last 10 years since the default and devaluation. It's grown by something around 90%. It's practically the fastest growing economy in the hemisphere. And it isn't just economic growth, of course. You had a reduction in poverty by 2/3, reduction in extreme poverty by more than 3/4. And these are, by the way, these numbers, some people have challenged, of course, the inflation rate in Argentina, but those poverty numbers are based on the World Bank's estimate of prices, purchasing power parity, numbers that are separate, and they have not been challenged. Social spending in real inflation-adjusted terms has tripled. Employment by 2010, that's employment, reached the highest level on record. And unlike the growth that you see in most of the world, including the fastest growing economies in Asia, this growth was accompanied by a significant decrease in inequality. A simple measure of this is you can look at the income of the 95th percentile near the top versus the 5th percentile near the bottom. And in 2001, this ratio was 32-1. By 2010, it was 17-1. So by really almost any measure you can think of, this was a very successful story. And in fact, the government also created a number of social programs. The most important one, perhaps, is the universal allocation per child, which gives families a stipend for children, and it's a conditional cash transfer program like they have also in Brazil and Mexico, but it's bigger. It's the biggest really in Latin America. So these are big accomplishments, and so how did they do this? Because after all, as was mentioned already, the economy was a basket case in 2001 after implementing first a series of neoliberal reforms that didn't work, but then doing, and again, I think this is going to have implications for a lot of the world today, because what they tried to do for 3.5 years from the recession that began in the middle of 1998 was what's called an internal devaluation. That's what they're trying right now in Spain and Greece and Portugal and Ireland and other countries, in Italy as well. What you do is, basically what this says is you keep your exchange rate fixed. And of course, that means in the euro, that means keeping the euro. But in this case, it was the peso was pegged to the dollar. And since you can't devalue, you basically devalue in real terms by pushing down wages. And the way you do that is you create massive unemployment. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's actually how it works, or is supposed to work. And of course, it didn't work in Argentina. They tried it for 3.5 years, and the economy just kept getting worse. And so finally, at the end of 2001, they defaulted on the debt, and then a few weeks later, devalued the currency. Now, everybody is telling Greece and Spain and everyone else in Europe that this would be a horrible disaster. And I'm not going to get into it because the mechanics are somewhat different. But again, if you actually look at what happened to Argentina, the economy did decline, but only for one more quarter, for 3 months after the default and devaluation. And then it began to grow, and then it became very quickly the fastest growing economy in the hemisphere. And you heard the rest of most of the rest of the story. So how did they do that? Now, another myth that's been promoted is that this was all a commodities boom, that Argentina got lucky, they were exporting soybeans, and the price of soybeans rose, and that's what did it. Well, in fact, that's not true at all. In fact, exports in total, if you look at real contributions to growth, were only about 12%, contributed about 12% of the growth in the economy during 2002 to 2010. Now, if you take into account prices, that's in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms. If you take into account prices, it still wasn't an export-led growth experience by any means. You can look at agricultural or commodities as a percent of the economy. Okay, so that takes into account, you just have the total amount of exports divided by the GDP in nominal terms. That takes into account the price changes, not just quantity. And it didn't grow throughout this period. And you can do the same thing. We did this recently, just looked at, from the Food and Agriculture Organization, looked at soybean oil and soybean meal and all the soybean products. Still didn't contribute, maybe 1% of real growth, and still didn't grow as a percent of the economy in nominal terms. So there's no story you can tell that Argentina's expansion was a commodities boom or even an export-led experience. Okay, how did it recover? It was based on domestic investment and consumption. It was domestically led recovery. And why? Because it wasn't really the devaluation that was key. It was the devaluation, and this is the lesson for the European countries, by getting out from under the IMF and the policies that were being imposed on the economy, as the Troika is imposing in Europe, they were able to use sensible macroeconomic policies that promoted growth. Okay, expansionary fiscal and monetary policies as necessary. They also did a couple of other unorthodox things that were very important, taxing the windfall gains of the exporters, for example, that got a big gain from the devaluation, and also having the central bank target a stable and competitive real exchange rate over a long period of time, something that most central banks don't normally do, but was very important to the growth of the Argentine economy. So again, a lot of things helped. The devaluation helped in various ways. For one thing, a lot of money came back into the country that had fled because things, assets were cheaper as well. So, but it wasn't a trade story, and it wasn't an export-led growth story. And that's very important for people to understand. Another thing that's important, I think there's a lot of myths, really, that this story kind of goes against. One, which has been promoted by various economists to justify the stagnation of Europe and the United States, in the aftermath of the world crisis, world economic crisis, and recession and financial crisis, is that recessions caused by financial crises somehow take forever to recover from. And This has been promoted by serious economists like Ken Rogoff, Carmen Reinhardt, for example. And of course, this recession is different in a lot of ways. Our previous recessions in the United States, for example, were caused by the Federal Reserve raising interest rates, and this was different. It was caused by a collapse of a huge housing bubble. But you can see what happened in Argentina. They had a very serious financial crisis, for people who can remember the Corralito, for example. And yet, 3 months, they were growing, within 3 months. And with no help from the outside, I should say, by the way. No bailouts, okay? The opposite happened. The IMF and the World Bank and the IDB took $4 billion out of Argentina during their worst period in 2002, net drain of 4% of GDP. So they were able to do all that. Why? Because they had sensible macroeconomic policies. So that's one myth, I think, that's very important, and it's very important to the Europeans right now, who are in, a state of indefinite recession right now. I just got back from Spain, where the government is still doing what they told Argentina to do. They just cut 7 billion euros out of their healthcare system, which would be like cutting out a quarter of Medicaid in the United States. And this is what they're doing. They got 25% unemployment and 50% youth unemployment. So again, they're being told that there's nothing else they can do. And Argentina was told that at the same time. And I can remember it took us 3 years to convince the newspapers, like the Financial Times, that there was actually a recovery underway in Argentina. And so that's how much prejudice there was and remains against a government doing what is best for their own people. And I want to kind of emphasize that, because I live in the United States, where, the Wall Street has a veto over financial reform, and the pharmaceutical and insurance companies have a veto over health care reform. So I appreciate when a government can go and do what it promised to do for the electorate and then get reelected for doing that. That, to me, is what democracy is about. I think another thing, for those who are interested in this aspect of the United States, Charles Ferguson has a new book out. I think it's called Predator Nation. He's the guy who did the Academy Award-winning film Inside Job, where he just describes what he calls the semi-criminality of the banking system and how they run our polity and economy. And so this, to me, as I say, is a very important form of democracy. The government is taking on the most powerful interests when they have to in order to do this. And they did it internationally as well. And this is another thing I think that the Argentine experience shows. If you read the financial press every day, as I do, you would think that the most important thing that any developing country can do is do whatever international investors want and whatever international bondholders want. Well, clearly that's not always the case. Of course, it's always good to be able to borrow internationally. And the Argentine government has, always been taking steps, of course, to be able to do that. But it turned out not to be the most important thing in the world for that recovery. Finally, I just want to say one other thing about because it comes up all the time, and that is the inflation. Obviously, Argentina has had relatively high inflation since 2007, and higher than they want. But the thing to remember, and I think the media kind of takes advantage of the fact that people don't really understand inflation. So they pretend that any country that has high inflation is in trouble in some way. And we forget that some of the most successful development experiences in world history, like that of South Korea, took place in the 70s and early 80s with annual inflation of over 20%. It's real income that matters, okay? And the figures I'm giving you, those are real income. The poverty numbers, that's based on real income. And employment is what matters too. That's what matters to most people, okay? And so that is something I think that people have to keep in mind when they think about the experience. Now, that doesn't mean there's no problem, because obviously the problem with inflation over time is that it interferes with the exchange rate policy. It basically raises the real exchange rate if your trading partners have much lower inflation. But that's something I think also will be dealt with over time. But the most important thing is that the Argentine government didn't do what the neoliberal governments before it and all over the world still do, in the European. But they didn't sacrifice their economy and employment and economic growth in order to lower inflation. That was an important choice as well. Okay, I probably went over my time, so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Finally, our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Hernán Lorenzino. Hernán Lorenzino is a lawyer who obtained his law degree from the Law and Social Science College of the National University of La Plata. After earning his law degree, he specialized in finances, area to which he has devoted his entire professional career. Lorenzino has always worked in the public sector. He started working in the Ministry of Economy of the province of Buenos Aires. After fulfilling duties in different areas, he became an advisor of the Provincial Administration of Financing Policy and Public Credit, where he gained most of his experience in financial issues. In 2003, he took office as Provincial Manager of Financing Policy and Public Credit, where he led the restructuring of the province's defaulted debt. Later on, he served as financial representative of the Republic of Argentina in the city of Washington, D.C., and in May 2008, he took office as the Argentine Secretary of Finance. As such, Lorenzino has implemented a proactive agenda with respect to liability management, something which has offered the possibility to improve public debt maturities profile and the perception of the country's payment willingness. This agenda has paved the way for Lorenzino to lead, in 2010, a new debt exchange, this time aimed at holders of public securities that had not participated in the 2005 exchange. This transaction was a success, raising the exchange acceptance level above 91%, which represents an important step in financial normalization of the country. In December 2011, Mr. Lorenzino was designated as Minister of Economy and Public Finances in the new cabinet of President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner. Mr. Lorenzino, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Bueno, buenas noches a todas y a todos. It's going to be in English, I know. Good afternoon for all of you. When Jorge told me that it's going to be in English, I prepared a speech and I will read it. I work a lot about this speech because I worked in the plane last night. Then I want to read it. Well, thank you again. It's a great honor and a pleasure for me to participate as a speaker, especially in this panel. Thank you, Mark. It's difficult to talk better than you about Argentina. It's freaky for me. And thank you, Eric, for your work. As he mentioned, we work together with Jubilee in many respects, but especially in the case of responsible lending principles. We work together with UNCTAD and Jubilee. As I mentioned, it's a great honor to me to participate in this occasion, in this presentation of this book written by the Embassy of Argentina. As Minister of Economy of Argentina, but above all as Secretary of Finance during the execution of the 2010 Argentine debt exchange, Coqui, it's a pleasure for me to be here. I'm sorry, I forget it. And also as a financial representative of Argentina here in Washington, as the introducer said, and also, and before that, as the team leader of the Province of Buenos Aires Exchange in 2006, I feel fully familiarized with this process, but also with the factors that drove Argentina to the point of having to deal with the debt restructuring as a necessary step to face a new stage of economic and social growth. First of all, I would like to thank my friend Ambassador Arguello for this invitation and to congratulate, really congratulate the whole team that have conceived the idea of this book as a key tool to spread our own version of the Argentine default and the restructuring process that follow it. This is a key contribution to thwart the interested, wrong-existing perception that a part of the international society has of the Argentine experience, which is not more than the result of the power of lobby that some very influential groups have in the whole world, but especially here in the United States. I would also like to thank Jubilee for its cooperation and support in organizing this event, but most of all, as I mentioned before, for its strong fight against the action of vulture funds. I just want to mention briefly, as an example of the work Jubilee has been doing in favor of poor countries, the campaign they have begun against a new bill of law under analysis in the New York State Legislature, as Eric mentioned before. A bill of law that is focused in helping vulture funds litigation against poor countries. I have information that some very well-known, respectable institutions, American institutions like the New York Bar Association, the Business Council, the Clearing House, and the New York Bankers Association have opposed to this bill, as well as some private financial institutions. This kind of bill is very well known by us, since Argentina has been the very direct objective of all of them. So all the assistance and help Jubilee is doing regarding these issues is welcomed by Argentina. As I've been saying, it goes without saying that, in our opinion, these ideas regarding the Argentine experience are wrong. And Argentina's 2001 default myth and realities clearly shows that. I believe that. Personally, I expect this book to become an essential tool both in the media and in the academic field to deepen the state of the art regarding sovereign debt restructuring. The Argentine experience, particularly the role of vulture funds, should be seen as a clear example of the consequences of the lack of an institutional sovereign restructuring mechanism that may help the financial community to solve sovereign debt crisis in a rapid, orderly, and fair way. In this sense, with the threat of a deep recession in many regions of the world and the devastating ongoing effects of the international crisis still in place, the likelihood of new sovereign over-indebtedness is high. Therefore, the challenges facing the global economy are quite complex. Moreover, current sovereign debt crises have negative impacts not only in the economical and financial fields, but also in the political arena. As entire nations go through tough social economical situations, government's legitimacy is questioned as a result of the lack of tools to solve debt crisis. In my view, some of the solutions proposed for countries under sovereign debt stress will only worsen the problem. Austerity measures consistently overestimate their efficacy by neglecting their adverse effects on economic growth, especially in the short term, and thus its impact in the generations of revenues necessary to meet debt payments. Moreover, no signs appear on the horizon on how to tackle the extraordinary increases in stocks of public sector debt of many countries, resulting from the need to finance the bailout packages designed to help financial institutions. Debt problems will only be manageable if sustainable growth in the global economy is restored. Without growth, that is, without new jobs, robust domestic markets, income distribution, it will be impossible to ease debt burdens. Unfortunately, during the last couple of years, much was said, but little was done to at least persuade a strategy that could deliver sustainable relief in the near future for countries with sovereign debt challenges. Mathematically, the question is simple. The main problem to be solved is to lower the debt to GDP ratio. There are two ways to reduce a ratio: lowering the numerator or growing the denominator. If a country receives a bailout package, the numerator rises, and it becomes then more important to ensure that the denominator grows faster in order to lower the ratio. The message is clear: growth is the key. At least this is what Argentina did. From the very beginning of Néstor Kirchner's administration, reducing debt burden was one of the pillars of the financial and economic plan, and this aim was fully reached. As Mark said, in December 2003, total public debt to GDP was almost 140%, while in December 2011 it fell to 42%. Additionally, the national government put great efforts in the debt stock composition, turning the debt with the private sector to GDP ratio from 138% in December 2001, that is to say almost the whole public debt was in the hands of private sector at this moment, to less than 20%, 90% in December 2011. During the same period of time, debt denominated in foreign currency to GDP ratio that was 105% in December 2003 fell to 25% in 2011. So briefly, public debt in Argentina is not, I would say for the first time in our history, a big economic issue since 2003. I would like to say, since what we did since 2003, I would like to say a few words about another issue that is very important for us, as it is the lack of an institutional mechanism to solve situations as the one Argentina is still facing with its holdout creditors. Despite some policymakers and international organizations continue to deny the obvious, the need for an appropriate international framework for debt restructuring is, at this point, unavoidable. Regrettably, there is no consensus on any initiative that addresses this situation and organizes this kind of processes appropriately, in an efficient and rapid way, taking into account the interests of all parties involved. The only one that I know is what Eric mentioned, and I mentioned before, that is the principles for a responsible lending and borrowing at the UNCTAD. The importance of setting general principles to acknowledge the missing link in the international financial architecture is nothing new. During his speech before the UN in 2002, Gordon Brown, former British Prime Minister, already spoke about the perversity of the builder funds and the much-needed assistance for their victims. In the same direction, Henry Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, identified the legal system as one of the main concerns for the rule of law is on their side, leaving the issuers only able to reach for moral solution. In the current situation, looking at Europe, it becomes undeniable that we need to cooperate in order to build concrete implementation measures. I will pass all what I wrote about the principles because Eric mentioned. Argentina is a clear example of the lack of this institutional solution, in particular, the lack of a cram-down mechanism for sovereign debtors. Accordingly, our country managed to restructure more than 90% debt securities instrumented through two swap operations, notwithstanding which our people still need to deal with the issue of the 2000 default with private sector, bond private sectors. With the aim of deepening this analysis, at the end of last year, Argentina, together with World Bank, organized an international seminar called The Missing Link in International Financial Architecture, Sovereign Debt Restructuring, in which a broad of academic, public officers and experts from the private sector and the civil society have participated, as Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Richard Porch, and Mr. Lee Buckhead. This seminar was a great opportunity to listen theories and opinions regarding issues that are currently very relevant, for example, for the European countries. Of course, Greece was the center of the discussions, but it was also a very good opportunity for us to tell the world our own experience. This international seminar was also an opportunity to talk about the action of vulture funds. As I imagine everybody here already know, we call vulture fund to private corporations that seek to make profit by buying debt in default on the secondary market for pennies, then trying to recover up 10 times or more the purchase price, often by litigation. Typically, vulture funds' way of operation is very obscure and are set up in tax havens to avoid financial constraint and oversight, as the book revealed very well. And it's the case of the vulture funds that are against Argentina. In the case of Argentina, these funds bought our bonds when the bond prices were at their lower levels, that is, since the last month of 2001 and during 2002, and litigation began in 2003, even before Argentina was able to make a proposal to the market. Of course, our proposal, that was accepted by more than 90% of our creditors, was not accepted by the vulture funds, not in 2005, but also not in 2010. Litigation has continued for more than a decade in the United States and in almost every country in Europe, with increasing legal costs for both parties. And up to now, the vulture funds has been unable to get a dollar from this strategy. Their plan is wider than litigation, since they use every legal tool available. It is very well described in the book the way vulture funds have been lobbying both in the United States Congress and the New York State Legislature with attempts to put pressures on Argentina by proposing bills tailor-made to fit Argentina's debt situation. Well, in the issue regarding Argentina, the key of the discussion, without going any further, I want to mention some particular case. Last Thursday, the 7th, in the United States Congress, through the House Financial Services Committee, invited a group of experts and academics to discuss on the following topic: investor protection, the need to protect investors from the government. That was the topic. The discussion was referred to the following three specific cases. 1. The treatment of secure bondholders in the Chrysler bankruptcy. 2. The federal state mortgage servicing settlement. And 3. The Argentine debt litigation. In the issue regarding Argentina, the key of the discussion was if the Obama administration abused the investor rights by filing an amicus curiae in a legal case that involves Argentina, in favor of an interpretation that is general, but in this case benefits Argentina. The mere fact that this act of the American government can be seen as a breach of investors' rights shows the lobby power the vulture funds have. But, as I said, our country is not the only one that has to deal with vulture funds. Both in the past as in the present, these funds have been very efficient in subjugating both Latin American and African countries. Maybe the case of Peru is the most known, but there is a very broad range of cases that does not come up to light, but that represent a devastating cost for poor countries. That is why UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, an intergovernmental union integrating Mercosur and the Andean Community of Nations, in November 2010 entered a decision regarding vulture funds, through which UNASUR expressed its worries about the risk related to the actions of vulture funds in Latin America and urged the South American Council of Economy and Finances, an internal body of UNASUR, to elaborate a body of recommendations that would help to reduce the adverse effect of vulture funds in the region. Going back to the Argentine experience, and following the arguments proposed by the book that it is being presented today, in the Ministry of Economy we have been working on the answer to the following questions. Did Argentina defraud its creditors? Or, according to the book language, is it a myth or a reality that Argentina had defrauded its bondholders? To answer this question, it is necessary to deepen in a comparative analysis of the cash flows received by those holders that had participated in any of the two transactions against the cash flow received by those who had not. It is well remembered that there were several criticisms to 2001 Argentine debt default and the later restructuring operation in 2005, supplemented in 2010. This argument stemmed largely on those creditors seeking disproportionate advantage of the situation after buying bonds at very low prices due to default and intend to get 10 times or more than what they paid. The origin of the Argentine default is already well known as a result of an inconsistent economic model supported by the IMF and other international lending institutions, which, by affecting international reserves to a function of currency board, left the country unable to react to balance of payment deficits. The public sector of Argentina fell into a deep crisis which led to an income decrease up to the point of not being able to afford operative expenses. In late 2001, the country entered into a critical economic and social situation. Central administration resources for 2002 were about $14.5 billion, when in 2000 had been $41.4 billion. In 2002, debt maturities exceeded $30 billion, while the financial market, which foresaw the payment inability before the IMF, had not provided funding since mid-2001. Since 97% of total debt was denominated in foreign currency, there was no possibility of resorting to printing money for paying. Under these circumstances, the authorities could only decide on the timing to stop paying debt services. So, at that time, they kept paying until the resources were exhausted. That was what we changed in 2003. It is important to note the differences with the current case of Greece. Given Greece's inability to meet its commitment without external assistance, European countries fear the possible contagion of the crisis to the rest of the continent and the effect of a Greek default on major banks. In this scenario, the continuance of payment has been a priority not only for Greece, but for the European continent. Eurozone countries and the IMF, in which Directory Europe has a very important voting power, have invested many billions of euros in providing Greece with payment capacity to serve debt to its creditors, prolonging the costly struggle not to default on its payment obligation. In the case of Argentina, there was no comparable international intervention. The war did not come to rescue of Argentine creditors, as it does with Greece creditors. Okay. I'm sorry, I want to be more rapid. Sorry. Thanks to the policies implemented by Néstor Kirchner since 2003 to 2007 and Cristina Fernández since then, including debt restructuring, that is key, including debt restructuring, growth was actually higher than the conservative projections of the IMF. Since 2005, GDP level has been consistently higher than such projected, which translates into effective payment of GDP-linked securities. By the end of 2012, payments will be about 18 cents for every dollar of restructured debt. An overwhelming majority of creditors has accepted the new condition offered by the Republic. However, a minority of those securities, the vulture funds, want to get much more than what the other 90% got. Their argument is based on the improved solvency acquired thanks to the restructuring agreed with the remaining creditors. Their argument is not only unfair and lacking of solidarity, but also based on a false premise. Holdout creditors could receive a better treatment than those who accepted the exchange. That is nice. But as I have been saying, the key is growth. I'm finishing. Inclusive growth. That is, the one that creates jobs, opportunities, the one that is based on real economy, real things, a robust internal market, and not on speculation. In this sense, the Argentine experience cannot one more time be fruitful to other countries that are currently dealing with solvency and fiscal problems. As President Kirchner said, deaf people doesn't pay debts. I want to add to that. But when countries that survive default asking their people and their creditors a lot of sacrifice do pay debts, it should not pay holdouts, simply because it's not fair. Thank you so much.
It's late, but before the reception, we have time for up to 4 questions. I'll try to be fair in geographical terms. We have the lady here in the first row, the lady in the aisle, okay? 2 more. This gentleman and okay, this gentleman also there. We have a wireless mic. Yes.
Thank you so much for the presentations. It really is amazing, as a person living in the U.S. right now, what it must have been like to live under such incredible political leadership like the world has never seen. And I remember the unfortunate day that President Kirchner passed. It's such a loss, I think, for the whole world, given his leadership in Argentina, but as well as in all of South America and really the world, in showing that you can take a different path in dealing with international investors, and one that benefits your population. I just had 2 quick questions. I understand that in terms of, and they're both about the relationship with the United States, the U.S. made a decision to drop the GSP trade preferences for Argentina in March of this year as a result of the U.S. government taking a decision to side with corporations that had sued Argentina in the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. And I wonder, in the case of the vulture fund holdouts, what the U.S. position is. Has the U.S. government decided that the U.S. position is to side with the vulture funds, or is it actually siding with Argentina and recognizing the importance of the contributions that the restructuring has had on the economy? And so that, I think, is an important point in terms of our relationship, particularly because in relation to the second question, I think you all have been extremely diplomatic in referring to the vulture funds. They actually have an association here in the United States with a name. It's called the American Task Force Argentina, and it is made up primarily and bankrolled by the vulture funds and includes a number of other organizations that should not be associated with it to give it a sort of grassroots veneer. And they have successfully introduced a number of pieces of legislation, which I think your book extremely helpfully points out, that are working against Argentina in the U.S. Congress and trying to use the U.S. Congress as a mechanism to punish Argentina for what it's done. And so I wonder if any of you could comment on the legislation. People can find it in the book, such as the Judgment Evading Foreign States Accountability Act, which was obviously clearly written by vulture funds to punish Argentina. And if any of these are a current concern, if there are things that people in this room who might be able to be in contact with their representatives and senators in Congress could bring up in terms of actually taking concrete action as a result of this seminar and doing something to make sure that U.S. congressional policy as well as federal policy act in favor of the Argentine people and not in favor of the vulture funds. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take all the questions and then answer them all together. The lady over there in the aisle, please stand up for the mic.
Thank you. Cynthia Rush with Executive Intelligence Review. It seemed to me, Ministro Lorenzino, that your statement that there's no institutional mechanism internationally to face the holdouts, implicit in that is the idea that perhaps we need a new global financial system or a new international financial architecture, which Nestor Kirchner certainly defended. I wondered if you are familiar with the fact that in the United States there's a bill on the House floor now to reinstate the 1933 Glass-Steagall bill, which separated the activities of commercial banks from investment banks and was very effective until 1999 when it was repealed and then led to the floodgates opening for speculation ending in the 2008 crisis. This is something which my magazine is defending very strongly, proposing not only for the US, but some similar standard for Europe as a way to deal with this crazy debt situation, get rid of this illegitimate speculative debt, and then get on to the task of productive investment. I have a report that I brought you that I'll give to you when this is over, that we've just produced on how to create an economic renaissance in Southern Europe, the Mediterranean region, and Africa, with a chapter on what the Europeans can learn from Argentina. And many Europeans, as I'm sure you know and has been stated here, are looking to Argentina to deal with questions such as the debt restructuring, et cetera. But our view is we need to overhaul the entire system. And I'd like your views on this idea of separating commercial banks from speculative activity.
Now to this gentleman. Please stand up for the mic.
Hi, good evening. Two quick questions, kind of unrelated one to the other. First of all, how Argentinian government is thinking in dealing with the lobbyists regarding the propaganda against the country that we are seeing every day, even the semi-progressive media here in the United States, like NPR, for example. And second, completely unrelated, is in this case of continuing and the next step in the process of growth and continue having a process of income equality, if progressive tax reform is part of the agenda of the government in the next couple of years.
Finally, the gentleman by the mirror.
Hi. Thank you very much for this initiative. Really appreciate the opportunity to the embassy and to everyone here. I have one question actually, which is you emphasized during your speech about the composition of the public debt, and given the current situation of de-dollarization that the president.
Sorry,
yeah,
composition of?
of the debt of the portfolio.
Yeah.
And given the current situation in Argentina that the President mentioned a few weeks ago about de-dollarizing liabilities and assets as well, I'd like to ask you, coming forward, what should be expected in terms of inflation-linked bonds, given the situation with the inflation index as measured by the index?
Thank you. La primera la voy a dejar.
Por eso, los primeros amigos avanzan y vos cerrás, ¿eh? Okay. Marco, would you like to?
I think they weren't really addressed to me.
Yeah.
It seems like the others were.
Please.
Well, I'll just make a few comments in response to all of the questions, and I do believe most of them are directed to the minister. But in terms of the vulture funds legislation that was brought up, as well as the index that exists in the book, I think one of the places where we are seeing again where this legislation is really in front right now, and I think has much more the possibility to move as opposed to even in the U.S. Congress, even with the reality that a small subsection of financial services sponsored vulture funds to testify before Congress last week. I think the reality of the legislation that you quoted speaks specifically to two pieces of legislation that are in the New York Senate and Assembly, which we referenced. So the first one is Senate 6949. And that is the specific one in the New York Senate which would allow vulture funds to litigate endlessly, to essentially litigate countries into submission, and even when one court says, you know what, this is not going to move forward, the potential is there for them to actually go back to the same court and do the same case again. And ultimately what we're talking about there is legal fees. There are many countries around the world, when we start talking about Zambia, the Ivory Coast, that would just be litigated into submission, let alone the unfairness of this type of litigation. The other piece of legislation, which I think is very concerning, is in the Assembly. That's 7967 in New York. And you could find out more about these pieces, as well as how to look at it, since the next 2 weeks is the window, on our website, jubileeusa.org. And then just to make a comment in reference to the second person who raised questions, I think from our perspective, it goes to what's missing from the international financial architecture, so that as countries continue to run into these situations, there are true solutions to deal with them, and even right now, for the financial crisis, true solutions to the international debt crisis. And so, the last point, just to reiterate, as well as what the minister talked about, but looking at a sovereign debt resolution mechanism that is fair and that is transparent and that is neutral is absolutely necessary. And second, missing from the international financial architecture, the principles of responsible lending and borrowing. The last piece, I think, just because it's another piece that I wanted to bring up that we can extrapolate from this book that the embassy is putting up, is that also the relation to tax issues and particularly to tax havens. Not only when we're looking at vulture funds, but when we're looking at positive growth within a particular country, tax havens are one of those things that not only protect vulture funds, but also make it more difficult for countries to experience positive growth, because they are essentially moving out of a country profits that are not facing any kind of taxation. So I think when we talk about the international financial architecture, it's also important to look at that. And I will turn the rest of the comments over to the minister.
Thank you, Eric. One word about the legislation. I think the problem is lobbying, because if you think in that legislation, it's clear that the lobby is behind the legislation, but I think that it's not so clear. I think it's my opinion about the society, the American society, is that those legislation will be negative for the state of New York, for example. Because if you think those legislation as are clearly against the market or against what the market needs in order to work efficiently, and then at the beginning could be a good, a victory for lobbyists, for budget funds against one country or another country. But at the end of the day, what you have is a less respectable or reliable market. And for the state of New York, for example, that is absolutely crucial. Then I think that need to be clarified. In relation with the institutional mechanism, I don't know, we don't know, and we are not proposing any in particular. What we are asking is for a mechanism that avoid what we are suffering, and we believe other countries suffer in the past, but we will suffer in the future. Even much more when this restructuring process that began with Greece maybe will repeat in other countries. Then what we are asking is for a discussion. Maybe the principles, the voluntary principles of responsible lending and borrowing, it's a good first step. But we are not saying that we prefer one mechanism above other. In terms of the domestic agenda, has nothing to do with this meeting, but in any case, as this government demonstrated since 2003, we deal with every problem that we face in our economy. Then some mention taxes, or other mention, I think, I'm not sure what was your specific question, but if the question is in terms of the index, we are dealing with that process with the with the assistance of the IMF, and we are expecting to have a new CPI, national CPI for 2013. But in every respect, we deal with every issues that appear in order to maintain the path of growth. As I mentioned in my presentation, for us, we have only one objective, that is to maintain growth, inclusive growth, growth that create jobs, to create inclusion, to improve the citizen life every day. That is the only objective that this government has, and we will maintain it in the future. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Marc. Muchas gracias.
We invite you now to the reception in the foyer.
Haven't called you yet, but I will.